Welcome back. We're going to discuss Taoism today, uh, beginning with a little quote from Lao Tzu, who is generally considered the founder of Taoism. Says, "Health is the greatest possession, contentment the greatest treasure, confidence is the greatest friend, non-being is the greatest joy." See some similarities there, potentially with Buddhism, with the stress on non-being. But in general, we'll see that Taoism is focused on being in sync with the natural order and the natural flow of things, and less concerned with society or the sort of artificial world, and it's about being in sync with the natural world. So Taoism arose during what's called the Warring States period. There's some sort of more subtle distinctions you may have noticed in the reading between different parts of this, but all of this is basically the period before what's called the Qin dynasty. So the Qin dynasty is how China gets its name, and it was the first sort of unified Chinese empire. It didn't last very long, actually, there were a series of other empires, but it was the first time that all the parts of China had been unified under one ruler. So before this period, there was a great deal of conflict, a great deal of unrest. It's called the Warring States period. So this is beginning around 700 BC. So like many of the other important developments in religion that we saw during the Axial Age, this is during that time broadly. So there was no China yet. There were different nations. At a certain point, there were about 7 large states that were all at odds with each other. And so it was around 200 BC, which is actually around the time that Rome was becoming a prominent state as well in the Mediterranean. In China, the Qin finally conquered the other 6 warring states, united China under a single emperor, and gave China its name. And it was during this period that Chinese philosophy, the Chinese philosophy that we know, if you're familiar with it at all, Confucius, Mencius, and Lao Tzu, all of these strains of Chinese philosophy all sort of began and flourished during this time. As we'll see, they all are rooted in earlier religious practices, and they adopt some of those earlier practices, but they began to sort of to build a philosophy around those practices. So we won't be talking about Confucianism in much detail in this course. Broadly, Confucianism is very concerned with the social order and what is your role in the society, and the right thing to do is to fulfill your role, whether you be an emperor or a peasant. It's fairly rigid in its sense of social order and the importance of that. It's meant to reflect a sort of heavenly order. Taoism, on the other hand, is less concerned with social order and much more concerned with being, again, in sync with nature, right? There is, according to Taoism, a natural order of things, and that is, to the extent that they care about the social order, they want it to be in sync with nature. So nature for the Taoist is supreme, and everything sort of follows from that. So during this Warring States period, as you might imagine, it was a fertile time for military people. If you wanted to sort of rise in the ranks of the military, there was lots of opportunity, right, to win some battles and gain some acclaim and rise in the ranks. If you were a political advisor, or really anyone in politics, there was a lot of political machinations going on, and a lot of people making money, gaining power, right? It was a regular industry at the time. And some of these advisors were just in it for the money or in for political advancement, but some of them, so Lao Tzu was one of these people. He was involved in politics, but he did so because he actually was interested in virtue and right conduct and what is the correct way to run a society, to run a state, and so on. So, and pardon me, my pronunciation is not great with some of these names, right? But Lao Tzu was born Li Er. He was born in an upper class family, not unlike Siddhartha, well educated, and so he was employed as a librarian in the southern state of Chu. So that was not Qin, right, which was finally the state that ultimately conquered. He was in a different one. But at some point he retired from his job as librarian, and all we know of him is that he went off to the far west of what is now China, and basically disappeared. Right? He just kind of checked out from society. But the story is that as he was leaving, he encountered a guard or gatekeeper who was sort of at the frontier, a frontier soldier or something, and he asked Lao Tzu, "Hey, where are you going? What are you up to?" And Lao Tzu dictated a manuscript to that gatekeeper that became known as the Tao Te Ching, and it's the first important text of Taoism. Now, did this story actually happen? Probably not, right? Most scholars think that the Tao Te Ching is the work of multiple authors, and it's just been attributed to Lao Tzu. So ultimately, Taoism and Confucianism grow apart in very starkly different directions. But early on, right, at the time of the Tao Te Ching, it's not so pronounced, the difference. So again, as we said, Confucianism says, your job, right, your sort of moral imperative is to fulfill your social duty. And the Tao Te Ching is very focused on social order and politics as well. But it adds the extra layer, right, that everything, even this social order, is based on a more fundamental natural order. And it's not so much the stress that, the emperor is divine or divinely appointed, and therefore, everyone must serve the emperor. There's a natural order that's more important, right, than the emperor. And for anyone from a peasant to an emperor to succeed in life or get through this life, you're going to want to be aligned with the natural order. Taken to its natural conclusion, later versions of Taoism began more and more to reject participation in the political world and the social world, and later began to advocate what's called non-action, right, which is to just completely go with the flow and try as little as possible to sort of try as little as possible to impose your will on the world, but just to go with what nature brings. So the Tao is right, the source of all things, of all life, right? Sort of like Brahman in the Hindu religion, it's invisible, infinite, unchanging, and it's the source of everything, right? It's not a god, it's not anthropomorphic, it doesn't particularly, it's not something you can pray to or sacrifice to that will then help, rain, get you rain for your crops or anything like that. It's more of a force, but not even a force of nature. It's not like it's the wind, but it's just the general ground of being for everything, right? Now, in early Taoism, the Tao is not neutral. It's not that it is uninterested in humans. It is a generally beneficent force. And so, if you can get yourself in tune with the Tao, right, and go with the flow of the Tao, good things will come to you, because the Tao is sort of aimed at good things or is a source of good things. So if you are an expert Taoist, you're called a sage. They're similar to, they kind of inherited the role of with the shamans of earlier Chinese religion. So shamans were sort of, people that could harness the powers of the universe, and you could go to a shaman and they might help you, get pregnant or whatever help you needed. Taoists sort of fill that role, and they do have some supernatural powers that were attributed to them. So sages were supposed to have been, immune to poison, could talk to animals, had sort of extreme sexual potency, and lived for very long. And apparently their bodies were very supple and soft because they were, you know, Taoism is very much like it's not about strength, right? It's about being passive or being receptive, right? So the sage is not considered to be muscular and strong, but considered to be soft and sort of supple and receptive to the way the Tao is operating. They were also, leaders in the society, right? So they weren't completely they weren't living in caves or anything. They were trusted leaders and advisors in the community, um, at least for sure in the earlier periods of Taoism. Wu Wei, right, the principle of non-action, as it developed early on, didn't necessarily mean doing nothing, and it certainly didn't mean checking out from society. But what it meant was sort of nonviolence, right, avoiding force and acting in line with the Tao, not forcing your will onto things, but letting things flow naturally. And this is the Taoist philosophy of leadership as well, right? To avoid use of force whenever possible, and instead to let the natural force of the Tao use its power for you, right? It's certainly much more powerful, according to Taoism, than you could possibly be, and so let the Tao, right, do the heavy lifting. So the way you became a sage, right, and became powerful in harnessing the Tao is a practice called cultivating life. So they involved various kinds of physical activity, certain breathing exercises, certain posture exercises, not unlike yoga, kind of calisthenics, right? And then as well as retaining sexual energy, so abstaining from sexual contact in order to sort of gather chi or life force. We'll talk about all these things like, probably the yin and yang and chi and tai chi may come to your mind if you think of Taoism. Those weren't so emphasized earlier on, and they're actually older concepts that come from the earlier era of like the shamans and stuff, but they do later come and become incorporated into Taoism. So we'll address those a bit later. But if these poses look a bit like Tai Chi, that's not a coincidence. Cultivating life also included certain lifestyle and attitude choices. So, the sage should avoid the excitement of desire for and attachment to material things. It sounds very much like the Buddhist prescription as well, right? Desire is what was the source of suffering for the Buddhist, and likewise, the sage should not be too attached to any particular material thing. And also, you shouldn't tire yourself out, right? Just sort of beating your head against the wall. The mind, the emotions, the senses, they shouldn't get overexcited. They should be more passive, and again, let the Tao carry you, right? Instead of fighting against it. And so this is not to say that you shouldn't be productive or shouldn't do anything, but it's more about being efficient, right? The activity should take the least intrusive form, right? If you're plowing a field, right, just the plow should go where it wants to go, right? Why waste time and energy? And you should know when to stop, right? When you're not gonna, you're too tired, you're not gonna do anything effective, you're gonna make mistakes. Know when to take a break. Right? So Lao Tzu was sort of the founder of Taoism, and then there are later Taoist writers who began this sort of split, this more extreme split with Confucianism, this more extreme move away from engagement with society. So Jiangsu and Li Tzu, again, my pronunciation is not great. So here it's full swing warring states period. There are nobles everywhere looking to maneuver for political power and wealth, and the Taoists are beginning to get sort of disgusted with it, right? So Lao Tzu thought that you could be a good Taoist and be involved in politics and, do it in the proper way. These later thinkers gave up on any hope of being able to be involved in these sort of like scummy, kinds of dealings of politicians, and instead said, you just need to move away from the world of like greed and seeking power, and in general social conventions in general they became less interested in and started to resemble more, the sage who lives in a cave, right, and just lives in nature. So by the time we get to these later writers, Cheng Su and Li Tzu, there's no respect for politicians. There's little regard for the emperor at all. Total rejection of Confucianism, right? Again, Confucianism is interested in what's the proper way to rule, right? How the emperor is still sort of divine, and there is a structure that we should follow. The Taoists began to reject all of that structure, and the sage becomes a sort of different character as well. Remember, in the Tao Te Ching, the sage might be, a politician, but like a wise and benevolent one. But for these later Taoists, the sage needs to be just completely uninvolved with any of these worldly affairs. The nature of the Tao started to change as well. Remember, I said that the Tao was a benevolent force, even though it was very abstract and not something you necessarily, could pray to or sacrifice to. But it was generally aimed at the good for you, and if you could get in to the flow of the Tao, you would get towards the good. Now with these later Taoists, the Tao is just neutral entirely, and it just does what it does, and it's not necessarily good or bad. It's sort of beyond those categories, right? And the Tao doesn't necessarily control events, right? It just is the force that allows everything to happen. So it's just sort of like, I don't know, the battery of the universe or something like that. So there were significant changes over time in Taoism, but this, it is still recognizable, right? The core construct of the Tao, the belief in the Tao is this invisible force from which everything flows, that remained the same. The figure of the sage remained, even though they became less interested in participating in society and in politics. So Chuang Tzu deduced from sort of the basic tenets of Taoism that still remained, that since everything derives from the Tao, that means that no particular being is any better than any other one, and so arrived at the principle of the equality of all things, right? So this is fairly radical. This implies that emperors are no better than you, and you are not necessarily any better than a squirrel, right? And all things have sort of the same rights or the same status. In these later versions, the sage still has his supernatural powers of speaking to animals, flying, super strength. And they still kind of looked in many ways like the ancient shamans of the Chinese religion. But here they were considered real, right? So from the perspective of a Taoist of this period, they would have said, well, the shamans, they were doing a lot of tricks, a lot of sleight of hand, whereas the Taoist sage is doing real magic, right? And the practices of health and caring for the body and reducing excitement and desire, that all remained similar as well in later Taoism. So, right, if you had sort of thought you knew anything about Taoism, you might have said, well, what about yin and yang? What about the I Ching? Maybe you've heard of the I Ching. So, yeah, these are all part of Taoism later on, but they also sort of predate Taoism. And they kind of work their way into various kinds of Chinese philosophy because they've just been around forever. So yin and yang are sort of considered the two components of the Tao in some later Taoist thinking. So instead of being a single indivisible force, it's sort of a combination of forces. And so there's the yin is sort of the darker, colder, associated with the moon, associated with female energy. The yang is considered male, hotter, associated with the sun, more active force. There's obviously some gender stereotypes built in there. And this is all, again, it's much older than Taoism, but it was incorporated into Taoism, and they were taken to be the two complementary parts of the Tao, right? You notice the two dots. You've got the black part, the yin, and then the white part, the yang, and then you have a dot of white in the yin and a dot of black in the yang, which is meant to say that the two are sort of unified. They don't come apart, and they can't really be that cleanly distinguished, right? Also, the notion of Qi or life force, and the I Ching, which was I don't know if you've ever seen. There are these days the more modern ones almost look like dominoes or something, but originally the I Ching was that you would use grass stalks, and the I Ching was a book of divination. Divination means telling the future. So they would take these grass stalks and you sort of throw them and they fall into certain patterns, and that can be interpreted as to what the future may hold. So these were originally practiced by shamans, and early Taoists would probably have wanted to dissociate themselves from those sort of practices, but inevitably everything sort of blends together, and so they worked their way, these ancient practices, back into Taoism. So again, the I Ching, it was a manual for divination, learning the will of the gods, what is the future, getting some advice of what to do, for anything in business or when to plant your crops or who to marry or whatever. Similar things are common in many polytheistic cultures. Often they were associated with sacrifice. You sacrifice an animal, and then by the arrangement of its entrails after the sacrifice, you could a priest could determine the future and things like that. Here, with I Ching, they used grass stalks, and you see sort of the sticks there in the picture there, so that it's the more modern version and more regimented. But each of those various arrangements has a different meaning that could predict the future for you. So later Taoists, right? They adopted this shamanistic practice, but instead of saying the gods are telling us what to do, they said, well, this is the Tao sort of guiding the grass stalks. And if we, the Tao kind of again is the force that directs things, or at least energizes things, and so the grass stalks are going to fall in a pattern according to the Tao, and then that will give you some indication possibly of what's going to happen in the future, or which way the Tao is flowing. And the last concept associated with Taoism, Qi, right, literally means breath, but more generally it represents life force, right, the force that animates all living things. Notice it's different than the Tao. It's sort of a part of the Tao. The Tao is the force of everything, so even non-living things comes from the Tao. But then living things, in particular, Qi is this life force that animates them. And again, Qi is also a notion that was earlier than Taoism, but was incorporated into Taoism. It's considered sometimes to not be completely distinct from the Tao, but sort of, metaphorically a wave or a current in the ocean of the Tao, right, that's specific to living things. And there were specific physical exercises that were supposed to help bring the Qi into the body in a more efficient way and channel it around the body, and this is Tai Chi is one of those practices. So relatively brief sort of overview of Taoism. Soon we'll be getting back to the story of the three Abrahamic traditions, but while we're in the axial age, I wanted to hop around the globe a little bit and look at what's going on outside of our specific culture here in the West. So I hope that was of some interest to you, and I will see you next time.